Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today we're going to be in conversation about the history of hacking. My guest for this is Scott J. Shapiro, who's a professor of law and philosophy at Yale Law School and director of the Yale Center for Law and Philosophy and its CyberSecurity Lab. He joins us for a conversation about his book called Fancy Bear Goes Phishing, the Dark History of the Information Age and 5 Extraordinary Hacks. Scott Shapiro, it is my good pleasure to welcome you to this program.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's a real pleasure.
This is not a direct quote, but basically you say what makes computing possible is what makes hacking possible, that they're really inseparable from one another. Tell me more about that. Why is that so?
Yeah, so I teach in a law school, but I was trained as a philosopher, and I tend to think philosophically. What I tried to show in Fancy Bear Goes Phishing, that the very things that make general computing possible also make hacking possible, which is a kind of an amazing consequence. It means that we can't ever get rid of hacking without getting rid of our computers because they're based on the same principles. If you think about it, it's just unbelievable that you can go into a store or over the internet and just buy a general computing device that can run any program and that can solve any solvable problem. And that is just an amazing fact about the world, that these machines can exist, and they exist because of certain philosophical ideas that were discovered by computer scientists and thinkers like Alan Turing. And what he showed was that if you understand the way if you understand what computation is, you should be able to put together a machine that does the computation. And that's, in fact, of course, we're talking to each other through computing devices. And what I try to show in Fancy Bear Goes Phishing is that this amazing world in which we live in contains the seeds of its own demise, because the very principles that allow us to download programs from the internet and switch between email and word processing and TikTok are the very, very principles that hackers exploit. And I can go into that in more detail, but it's beginning of conversation. I don't want to weigh us down, but that's in some sense the nub of it. The computers exist, hacking exists.
We encourage details on this show. Is it that we have such a negative view about hacking? Is that just sort of a value we put on it, but really hacking is no different than any perhaps other computer program? It's just putting code into a computer that operates, and maybe it operates in a way we don't want it to, but really when it comes to computing, it's kind of the same thing.
What's really interesting is that the word hack or hacker was once a term of approval. So you were a hacker if you could figure out some clever solution to a technical problem and kind of do it in a quick way or in an elegant way. And so hacking, in that sense, finding clever solutions to difficult problems, was it was great if you were a hacker. In the 1970s and 80s, that term started to change from a term of approbation to disapprobation, because what people decided to do was use those clever hacks to subvert the intentions of the program. So for many people who saw their programs subverted, or users who lost their data because of some clever exploitation of a vulnerability, they didn't like it, and for good reason. And so those people got called hackers with the negative connotation.
So the term hacking existed before computing?
Yes, the term I believe it's oh wow, now I'm forgetting. Was Taxi Cab, and before that, I think I don't want to say anything that was being
This
recorded.
might have
I
been
may be wrong.
my bad for going into etymology
No,
of the
no, no, no.
word.
But there's actually an interesting etymology of the word hack, and certainly predates computing. But when Stephen Levy, the great tech writer, wrote a book called Hackers, and he talked about the hacker's ethic, he meant it as a good thing. What did the hackers believe? They believed information wants to be free, that people should not place limitations on the ability to change programs, things like that, that we associate with curiosity and freedom to innovate, very different from the kind of crazy technopath, morbidly obese person who lives in their basement, doesn't get a job, drinks energy drinks all day, wears a hoodie, and is trying to use your webcam to see you make dinner.
Let me just follow up on that very last thing you said before we dive back into history. Most hackers actually don't care what you're doing.
Yeah.
They're not
So
interested in watching you through your video camera. They're not even interested in what you have on your computer.
yeah, I mean, think about it this way. The vast majority of cyber criminals. So let's just be clear. Hackers, there are many, it's traditional to distinguish between white hat hackers, black hat hackers, maybe legitimate hackers or ethical hackers versus malicious hackers. So I hack, but I do it in a legal way and I don't exploit or invade other people's privacy. So hacking itself is not bad. What we're talking about right now is cybercrime, where you really do achieve unauthorized access. And for those people, they are engaged in malicious activity.
What kind of malicious activity, though?
Oh, they want to put malware on your computer. They want to bring your computer, enslave it into a botnet, which is an interconnected network of infected computers, to send spam or to launch a distributed denial of service attack to shut down a website or what have you. Those people who do that are out to make money. And the reason why they hack and they engage in cybercrime is typically because they live in places with not robust tech economies, and they're trying to make money on the side. And they really don't care how you're making your shrimp risotto. They just want to use your computer to make a little bit of money. Cybercrime is not big business. I mean, it is big business in the sense that there's an enormous amount of money made, but it's a it's a high volume, low stakes game that each computer is worth very little to them, but they can do it at scale and they can make some money by getting them all together. I find that comforting because that means that all you have to do is make it a little harder to make cybercrime not pay for your people who might be after you, and they will, 999 times out of 1,000 leave you alone unless you're a high value target like a politician or a journalist or something like that. That's a different story. But for most of us, for the vast majority of us, they just want to make some money. And I say to people, don't do the equivalent of leaving keys in your car while it's running. That's you'll just make it easier for car thieves. Shut off your car, take your keys, you'll be fine.
They're looking for the low hanging fruit. They're looking for people whose passwords are 1234. Or exactly. I mean, the people. Mm-hmm.
Yes, exactly. They're looking for the people who have their password as password, people who have had data breaches and then don't change their passwords, people who click on links from people they don't know. They open attachments from people they don't know. I always say, like, when I'm in New York City right now. Somebody came up to me and said, "Hey," just came up to me on the street and said, "Hey, do you want to try, this brownie I made?" Well, if I don't know them, I'm not going to try it. That's the same thing about clicking links on the internet. Just don't do it if you don't know the person. Write back to them. Say, hey, why is this? Who are you? Can you tell me something about yourself? And I think things like that, just from a practical consequence of this history, kind of tells you that, just don't make it easy.
Or even if you do get an email or a note from somebody you do know, but it's uncharacteristic in nature, they say something that they normally wouldn't say, or in a way that they wouldn't say, I make sure never to click on those.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And so just like for people that you work with, especially if it involves money transfers, you should always have what's called an out of band method for communicating. So it was funny because when my book was due, there was a ransomware attack on the publisher. So like my book was literally hacked, right? I mean, it's like and so my editor wrote to me and said, "Oh, we have this problem. Can you send it to me? I'm writing from Gmail." And I called him because like it was just I didn't want to send it to somebody I didn't know. And he said he was my editor, but how did I know? So I figured for something this important, I will call him. And so I called him, and it turned out to be him. So, just very, very basic things. You don't have to have passwords that are 25 letters long.
I think a lot of people are getting, and I see people getting, and I don't know if this even, maybe we should even talk about what hacking is, if qualifies as hacking, but on Facebook, people's accounts get hacked into quite frequently, and then they send out, or duplicated, which I guess isn't necessarily a hack. You're just duplicating an account. But one of the things I commonly get on Facebook is a note from someone who says, "Look who died," and then a click. It doesn't say who died or anything. It just says, "Look who died." And I know not to click those, but
Right,
they're tempting.
right, exactly. So let's just say what hacking is. So hacking is when you try to defeat a security mechanism. So this is the example I use is if a door is open and you walk through it, that's not breaking and entering, right? That's because that it may be trespass, but it's not breaking and entering because you didn't break into it. But if there's a lock and you pick the lock, well, that's breaking and entering. Same thing about hacking. If your account doesn't have a password, let's say, and there are many parts of computer accounts that actually don't have passwords. If you don't have a password and the system just lets you in, you haven't hacked it because you haven't defeated a mechanism designed to keep you out. Now, in the case of social media, hacks on Meta, Facebook, Twitter, all those things, they are unbelievably common. And it's not that they want to get, money from you per se, but they want to send out spam, advertisements, things like that, because that's how they make their money. And what I tell people is the most important, just enable two-factor authentication. The reason why you want to enable two-factor authentication, that is, not just have your username and password, but have some code sent to your cell phone or some authentication app that you have maybe through work. And the reason why you want to do that is not only because you don't want your account hacked, but if you don't do it, the hackers are going to enable it, and then you're never going to get back into it. So if you enable two-factor authentication, they won't be able to get in because they won't have your cell phone. If you don't, they will be able to get in, and you won't be able to get in after they enable it. So just enable two-factor authentication because it's a very, very, very common thing. And there's nobody at Facebook. I mean, there are people to talk to, but they have billions of users. It's very difficult to get any human on the line to get this thing fixed.
I do want to dive back into the history and ask you more to talk about Alan Turing. Now, many of us are reacquainted in the public imagination with Alan Turing because of a few years ago, the blockbuster motion film, The Imitation Game. Alan Turing was a mathematician who played a huge role in computing, also helped the British break the Nazi codes in World War II. He'd become a national hero before he was persecuted for being homosexual in the middle of the 20th century, and then he would commit suicide. But perhaps, well, I mean, I don't know if that's the first hack or not of breaking the Nazi code, but there's another part about Alan Turing that's important for our conversation, and that is Alan Turing and what he created was called the Metacode in 1936. What is that?
Yeah, so this is what let's dive in a little bit more in detail that we talked about at the very beginning. Now that we're warmed up, the idea that the very principles that make computing possible make hacking possible. Let's talk about what those principles are. They're principles of what I call metacode. That is the code of code. They're the reason why we can build computers. The first principle of metacode is what I call physicality, which is that computation is a physical process of symbol manipulation. Now that sounds really complex and abstract, but it really isn't. Like all of elementary school is about learning how to manipulate symbols. Like when you add 11 plus 99, you're manipulating ones and nines and digits and carrying numbers and things like that. That is what computation is. And what Turing showed is that what a physical device needs to do to compute is to do only three things. It needs to can be able to read a symbol on a tape, to erase a symbol on a tape, and look up something in an instruction table to see whether it should erase a symbol or write a symbol or move. It means it's unbelievably primitive actions. But if you take these primitive actions, you sequence them in the right way with a physical device, you can compute things. And then what Turing showed was on top of that, it's not only that you can build a machine that can solve one problem, you can build a machine that can solve any solvable problem. Now, how could that possibly be the case? Well, this is the second principle known as duality, which is that code and data are interchangeable. What do I mean by that? Okay. What's code? Codes are instructions like print this document, assign a value to a variable, loop, these are instructions. Data is the information you supply to your program, to your instructions for it to compute. So the code would be add two numbers, the data would be 2 and 2, and the output would be 4. Now, code does things, data are the things that code does things to. They seem very different. Normally code is expressed in English, data is usually expressed in numbers. Now, what Turing showed was that code that we normally express in English or in computer language can always be represented by numbers. The fact that code can always be converted to numbers, and of course data can be represented by numbers, means that code and data, two things that are very, very different from each other, can be represented by the same kinds of symbols, namely numbers, and in particular, binary numbers, strings of ones and zeros. Now, why is this important? This is important because what Turing showed was if you could build a physical computing device that, let's say, adds two numbers or something like that, you could also build another device, physical device, that takes in not that where you don't build the code into the machine, but you so to speak, load it into the machine through what we call software now. There it would have been a tape of binary symbols, and then you feed it data, and so you can feed code and data to a computer. The computer can run the code that you just fed it, could run the instructions on the data you just fed it, and solve the problem that your instructions were meant to solve. That means that I don't have to have a computer for Zoom and a separate computer for email and a separate computer for word processing. All I can do is keep on feeding code and data, depending on what I want, in and out of my computer using just numbers. Now, okay, so I just spent 5 minutes telling you why general computing devices are possible. But what the astonishing thing is, there are many, many kinds of hacks, thousands of kinds of hacks. They have all kind of weird names, evil, let's say, side channel attacks, SQL injections, cross-site scripting, buffer overflow. They're all either of one of two types. They either exploit the physicality of a computer or the duality. Let me give you duality because it's the easiest one to describe. So you think you're downloading a program. Let's say you want to, there's a new social media platform just came out, and you want to download the app, and so you go to the Google App Store. Let's say you have an Android phone, and you go to and they don't really vet, their apps very well on the Google Play site. So what you do is you think you're downloading the new social media platform, but you're now downloading malicious code. So this is a very simple example of where your computer was designed to take any code you feed it. But what hackers did was they substituted one code for another, or even better, you think you're downloading data, but they slip in code, but your computer can't tell the difference because code and data are represented by the same symbols.
They're the same thing.
I'm sorry.
They're the same thing.
Yeah, they're the same
Inevitably
thing.
to the computer.
You just can't, the computer can't tell because there is no difference. Okay. It depends on what the programmer intended. Okay. And the computer doesn't know what you intended unless you're very specific about it. But the only way to stop hackers from slipping code in, malicious code in, when you're expecting data, is to not let computers run code and data based on numbers. But if you did that, we wouldn't have general computers anymore. We would have separate computers for everything we needed to do.
Right. I'd have a Zoom computer or
a Zoom computer or a
Facebook
email computer. It would be horrible. I mean, it used to be that way, right? You'd have a watch and a digital watch, and you'd have a calculator, and you'd have maybe something your cell phone could text. But there were all these different kinds of digital devices. Now we just have one thing that can do all those things. But the danger, the downside of having one thing that can do everything is that you may think that you're downloading something and somebody wants you to download and run something else. And that is how hacking, that's one main route how hacking happens. The other way is by exploiting the physical nature of the computing device, which I can describe how that works. But the point is that you see that in a way there's all this very, very technical stuff going on with hacking, but at bottom, it's either substituting code for data or data for code, or trying to exploit the physical limitations of your computing device. And that's, by the way, how we get fooled all the time, because we, human beings, are physical computing devices, and our brains are absurdly slow, and hackers fool us all the time by exploiting the physical limitations of our brains. So we get hacked too, not just our computers.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation with Scott Shapiro, professor of law and philosophy at Yale Law School and director of the Yale Center for Law and Philosophy in its CyberSecurity Lab. He joins us for a conversation about his book, The Dark History of the Information Age and 5 Extraordinary Hacks. I do want to talk about some of these extraordinary hacks. The first one you dive into is in the late 1980s, the Morris worm. And before I get in there, and I hope I'm not going too far off topic here, when I think this was like around 88 or 1988 or so. And just off the top of my head, I think of the movie, I was a kid at the time, but I think of the movie War Games with Matthew Broderick. Wasn't that before 1988?
Yes, that was
these hacks started happening.
That was, I believe, 1983, and the Morris worm was 1988. And
so what's War Games going off of? Is it just a fear of the time?
Yeah. Well, first of all, for the first time in the late 1970s, there was, I mean, I'm sure you remember this, and some of your listeners may not know about this, but there was this national chain called Radio Shack. And Radio Shack sold, a personal computer called the TRS-80. And the TRS-80 was, one of the first general computing devices ever. You could go into a store for like $1,500 or something like that at the time, and you can buy a general computing device. We had one in my school, and it ignited everyone's imagination. So this is the late 1970s, and then you have the Apple II come out, Steve Jobs and Wozniak come out. So now people are playing with computers, and like AI, there's a lot of hype and fear about it. So War Games is about some teenage kid who gets into the NORAD computer and almost launches a thermonuclear war. Ronald Reagan at the time sees the movie, and he speaks to the mucking mucks up in the military and say, "Hey, can this happen?" And they come back and they say, "Yeah, actually, yeah, it can happen. Not exactly the way in the movie, but things like this can possibly happen. Cybersecurity is a very, very important thing." And this starts legislation. We get the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act in 1986. We get the first one in 1984. So the War Games really was a movie that scared everyone. And 1988 becomes the first large-scale internet hack with the Morris worm, when Robert Tappan Morris Jr., who at the time was a 22-year-old graduate student at Cornell University, as a science experiment, released a self-replicating program, what we now call a computer worm, onto the internet and crashed it. He became a national figure. He was prosecuted and ultimately convicted. And one of the amazing parts of the story is the fact that when he crashed the internet, which is the first time it had happened, he didn't mean to do it. He had to call his dad and tell him, and his dad was the head of cybersecurity for the National Security Agency, which was not a call I think either of them Robert wanted to make or his father wanted to get.
Is it a coincidence? Is it just like, I happen to bring down the internet, and my dad happens to also be the head of the NSA?
Yeah, no, it's not a coincidence, because, and that's why, like, they grew up talking about computer security all the time, and talk about hacking all the time. Interestingly enough, his father worked with my father, not in the same department, but in the same building. My father, and I'm roughly the same age as Robert Morris Jr. So it not only caught my imagination because the first internet hack, and it's really interesting. It was like the first prosecution, first conviction. There are really interesting legal, cultural, technical issues, but also, like, we have very similar histories. Our fathers, I was obsessed with the Unix operating system. I went to Bell Labs with my dad for, take your son to work, and his father also worked at Bell Labs. He used to go to Bell Labs, so it felt very familiar to me. And one of the things I would just say, we're talking abstractly about philosophy and things like what is hacking, but the book is really filled with these stories of human beings who kind of get themselves into extraordinary circumstances, and sometimes it's tragic, sometimes it's actually kind of funny. And one of the things I try to make the book funny. I mean, Fancy Bear Goes Phishing, an attempt to give you a sense of that, like this, there's some whimsy in the book. But more importantly, what I'm trying to get across is that if you really want to understand what hacking is, we can explain the philosophy behind it and Metacode and all this kind of stuff. But ultimately, it's human beings who have, girlfriends, boyfriends, partners, enemies, rivals, mothers, fathers, kids, and they were all acting subject to cultural understandings of what computers should be used for, whose responsibility is it to be safe, that is there any legal liability for producing really bad software? No, there isn't. That's why we have really bad software. What I try to do is explain a lot of the technical stuff in easy to understand language, but more than anything, I want people to see that in some sense, the technology is beside the point. It's really about human beings and how can we guide people so that they not only produce better software that's more secure, but also change users' incentives so that they use their computers in a way that they don't exploit and victimize others.
I find it wild that our first anti-hacking laws came because of war games, because of a film. And so when William Morris Jr. breaks basically the internet in 1988, what is the internet? And I guess it's important to distinguish the internet from the World Wide Web.
Exactly. So the web has not been invented yet. Typically, so what is okay, let's just talk about what is the internet. The internet is a network of networks. So your radio station has a network, Yale University has a network. At my house, I have a network. But my network is different from your network. My home network is different from the Yale network, yet somehow we're all able to communicate, and we're all able to communicate because we follow the same principles of communication. They're called transmission protocols, and the acronyms are TCP/IP. Okay, so that was invented and built. The first internet transmission is often taken to be 1969. And so we're really 1970s, you see the different universities hooking up their networks to something called ARPANET, which then becomes the NSFNet, which then becomes what we call the internet. The World Wide Web was invented a little after this hack in 1989, and the first browsers come online 1992, then graphical ones 1993. The web is a way of using the internet in a very user-friendly way through browsers and websites. But before that, people were using email, they were sending files, they were doing, kind of lots of things in the hard way. And so people don't know how many computers were connected to the internet in 1988. People estimate maybe 10,000. Who knows? Nobody really knows. And so the first time that anybody had ever heard the word internet in popular media, the time it's used is November 4th, 1988, right after the Morris worm, because the media has to explain to people some big network of networks crashed. They don't know what to call it. So some people call it the internet, some people call it internet, some people call it the internet network. They're trying to figure out the way. And so Americans don't even know what this thing is. And they learn about it first in sense through war games, but then through this hack. And then the internet revolution in the early 1990s, that's when everyone starts to learn about it.
Yeah, that's when I started doing the internet, early 90s when I was still in college. Let's move into the 1990s. Tell me who was, or maybe even who is, though I don't think you specifically know. Tell me about, I should probably say, the Dark Avenger.
Yeah, so the next story that I moved to after Morris worm is the early 1990s, and the focal point changes of all places to Eastern Europe and to Bulgaria. Bulgaria at the time in the early 1990s, 91, 92, 93, 94, is the hot zone. It's the world's computer virus factory. And I was really interested, like, why Bulgaria? Like, of all places, why Bulgaria? Why are they pumping out all these viruses? And there's this name, handle, Dark Avenger. And this virus writer is reputed to be the best virus writer in the world, but nobody knows who this person is. And so in the chapters where I discuss the Bulgarian virus factory, I explain to people what a virus is, why Bulgaria, but also go on the hunt and try to figure out who Dark Avenger is. And only one person in the world, or two actually, Dark Avenger, and a woman named Sarah Gordon, who was a very, very early a virus researcher who struck up a relationship with Dark Avenger. Dark Avenger basically has a crush on her. He writes her a virus, dedicates a virus to her, and sends it in something that the world had never seen before, which was a polymorphic virus engine, which sounds really scary, which it is, which is what it did was it took any virus and it mutated it so that no detector could find it, but it could still do the same thing.
So it mutates itself. So it mutates. So does it change itself as it?
Yes, it changes itself, but not in a functional way. It just like scrambles things, but still does the right thing. Okay, but its blueprint changes. Okay,
so making it harder to defeat it, to stop it.
Yeah, you can't detect
like a real virus.
Yeah, right, exactly. So it's exactly like a real virus. Instead of natural selection doing it, you have the mutation engine built by Dark Avenger.
So I'm sorry, but that's fascinating. It's an engine within this I mean, not obviously a physical engine, but it's code within it that creates random changes to it.
Yes, and it's as bad as it sounds. For years, it took the antivirus industry a while to figure out how to defeat this. And he, by the way, he broke off his relationship, his correspondence with Sarah Gordon when he read on the internet that she was engaged to be married, and so he just broke it off. And so I spent a lot of time trying to figure out who this person is or who they are. And so you can read it in the book, The Hunt for Dark Avenger. Since the book has come out, I've had several people tell me they know Dark Avenger. I'm not so sure, but apparently these people say he liked my portrayal of this. But I don't, anybody can say they're Dark Avenger. So I was just really curious, who are these people? And one of the things you learn from this is that they're not crazy. There's this idea that if you write malware or you write viruses, that you must be a sociopath or what's called a technopath. And what Sarah Gordon found and research has found subsequently is that these people, and they tend to be young adolescent boys who then mature into young, immature men, tend to be young, immature men who eventually grow out of it. They're not sociopathic. They're just like a little behind, and they get into hacking through gaming culture, and that's why there's so much misogyny in the hacking world, is because there's so much misogyny in the gaming world, and that unfortunately get filtered so that it pushes women out of this field, and so one of the things that you discover is that either these virus writers age out and they go on and just become productive members of society, or if they're in parts of the world where there's no good tech industry, they'll do it on the side as a hustle. But again, they're not particularly interested in watching you do your dishes.
Why Bulgaria? Why is Bulgaria a hotspot in the 1990s for hacking?
So it turns out that in the 1980s, the Zhukov, who's the head of Bulgaria, wants to turn Bulgaria into the Silicon Valley of the of the Warsaw Pact of the Eastern Bloc. But what they did is that they teched up and they trained a whole generation of engineers, really good engineers, to do things, especially to reverse engineer Western technology and rebuild it in Bulgaria. But at the end of the day, when the Berlin Wall falls apart and Bulgaria transitions away from socialism, it's a shambles. There's no jobs for any of these highly skilled, underemployed men to get. So what do? They mess around and they write viruses. So this is the problem of underemployed young men. It's a familiar story in history, and that's what the story of Bulgaria was. Just very sophisticated, trained young men who had no outlet.
Scott Shapiro is our guest. He is the author of the book, Fancy Bear Goes Phishing, The Dark History of the Information Age and 5 Extraordinary Hacks. So the title of your book, Fancy Bear Goes Phishing, Fancy Bear is the hack that happens in 2016 against the DNC, a very famous hack alleged by, we could talk about Russia here, but when you talk about Bulgaria in the 90s, is there a parallel here to Russian hacking today?
I think no, not at all. They're completely different things. And let me explain to you why they're completely different. Not for the reason that you might think. One thing you might think is, well, Bulgaria is a different country than Russia. And like, why assume that just because they use Cyrillic, they're the same? But no, they're very different for a reason that unless you're a lawyer, you won't see. And I'm a lawyer, so let me take the opportunity. So, what the Bulgarian virus writers were doing were what we would call now cybercrime. It wasn't even crime then. Bulgaria did not have laws against hacking in the early 1990s, so they weren't even committing crime. But when they passed the laws, they were committing crimes. What the Russians were doing in 2015, 2016 with the Democratic National Committee wasn't what we would call cybercrime. It's what we would call cyber espionage. Okay. It is not crime in the sense that it's financially motivated by private individuals, but rather it is run by nation states and intelligence services who are trying to get information on their adversaries, on their rivals, in order to inform their political decision-making. These are very different things. When I said before with the cyber criminal, just make it a little harder and they'll go away, this does not apply to cyber espionage. If the NSA makes it difficult, or the White House makes it difficult for the Russians to hack their computers, the Russians are just going to try harder. And this is no knock on the Russians, because that's what we do. The Americans are probably the, not to be too patriotic here, but we're the greatest hackers in the world.
We are.
Oh, yeah.
And that's oftentimes lost when we talk about Russia and the 2016 hack.
I mean, the National Security Agency and its partners around the world, the Five Eyes, UK, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, just hoover up things all over the world. We don't even know how big, hundreds of billions of dollars gets put every year into exploitations of foreign networks. Nobody can compete with just the sheer scale. So what I try to explain to people in the Fancy Bear, just like with Bulgaria, I was really interested. Why Bulgaria? Why are all viruses coming out of Bulgaria? When the Fancy Bear hack, so Fancy Bear, by the way, is the code name for the elite Russian hacking, one of the elite Russian hacking units within military intelligence, the GRU. And one of the big mysteries that I had was why did the FBI, who knew that the Russians had infiltrated the DNC, why did it take them 9 months to seriously contact the DNC? And why did the DNC, having heard about this intrusion 9 months earlier, why did it take them so long to get the Russians out? Now, when I started this, and I think the standard view is that this was incompetence on the FBI's part and the DNC's part. This is not the case. Everyone was acting rationally. The FBI didn't take the hack of the DNC that seriously because the Russians were hacking everyone. And so he just called everyone saying, oh, you got hacked, you got hacked, you got hacked. Now, the DNC didn't take it that seriously either. It's because, they kind of expected it. But more importantly, they were afraid that the FBI was really trying to get information on Hillary Clinton's emails.
Because they were because the FBI was doing its own investigation on Hillary Clinton.
Because of a weird fact about the United States, which is the United States does not have a dedicated domestic intelligence service. The FBI is a hybrid organization which both does counterintelligence and law enforcement. So part of the FBI was investigating Hillary Clinton's emails. The other half was trying to get spies out of the United States. And also FBI prosecutors are not allowed to lie, but FBI agents are. So when the FBI agent calls up the DNC and says, hey, the Russians are in your thing, can you tell us what you have on your servers? They're like, we don't, first of all, big deal. They're in our networks. But secondly, I don't believe you. Maybe you're just trying to get information about Hillary Clinton. And so when you see the kind of rules that everyone's following, that nation states hack each other all the time, the FBI is this hybrid organization, and the DNC doesn't take it seriously because it just assumes it's going to be hacked and that the Russians are just going to use this for their own national security strategy, it doesn't sound so crazy anymore why nobody takes it all that seriously. What happens is that the rules of geopolitics change in 2016, and the information that is taken from the DNC gets released and weaponized. And then we move from something that what we would call cyber espionage to something darker, which is cyber war or cyber conflict. And so the Fancy Bear case is not only fascinating because it was so public, but it teaches us a lot, I think, about the way states think about hacking and how people respond to nation-state hacking in a different way than they respond to private individuals engaged in cybercrime.
Scott Shapiro, your previous book was a book on the history of war, and it's my understanding it was through that work that led you into wanting to look deeper into hacking. Tell me, how do you envision the future of cyber warfare?
Yeah, so I got into, as you mentioned, I got into this because I've written a book on war, history, the internationalists, where I wrote with my colleague Ona Hathaway, and it was a history of the regulation of war from 1600 to 2014. And then everyone would say, okay, great. Well, what about cyber war? And I didn't know. And everyone said, this is the new way of war. And, I came to the conclusion that that's just not true. That is, cyber war is way overhyped. And that cyber weapons are not what we think of them as perfect weapons. They are weapons of weak states, not weapons of strong states. Let me just say what I mean by that. When Russia was fighting with Ukraine and thought that Ukraine was not weak, they limited it was about 8 years of attacks to pure cyber attacks, ransomware attacks, denial of service attacks. When Russia thought that they were really stronger than Ukraine, people were saying, oh, now we're going to see cyber war like you never saw it before. And I'm on record for saying, no, it's the opposite. If Russia thinks it's really strong, it's not going to use cyber. It's going to use bombs. It's going to use tanks. It's going to use infantry. Strong states bomb, weak states hack. Now, of course, since all military systems are run by computers, there's hacking that takes place between both sides trying to disrupt the kinetic operations. But when people talk about cyber war, they think that you can fight the war just with computers. And that we're seeing cannot happen. The Russia invasion shows that you can't hold territory with cyber. It's very difficult to kill people with cyber. If you want to get rid of the grid, just bomb it. Don't try to hack it. And so what my claim is that when you see two equally matched sides that don't think they have a decisive advantage, you're going to see cyber conflict because it's an excellent form of harassment.
But limited.
I'm sorry?
But cyber warfare is limited. I mean, we're usually hearing about fears about the electrical grid going down, whole sectors being shut off.
Let's put it this way. Let's say Russia wanted to take the electrical system down in the United States. First of all, unbelievably difficult to do. You can't, because the way the United States works is that, like, we have a zillion electrical companies. We have tiny grids, and they're connected to other grids. It's not like there's not like the United States doesn't have an electric company. Like New Haven has its electric company, and so it was very hard to do just technically. But more importantly, just think about it. If Russia were to hack the electrical grid, that would be tantamount to war. Russia would have to think, oh my goodness, we are escalating this to the point where we could have a nuclear standoff. What if you're willing to go to the point of seriously taking down the electrical grid of a nuclear superpower? Why would you just waste your time with computer exploits? Just send a bomb. I mean, bombs are more effective, and they'll have the same consequence. That is, they'll really anger the other side and force it to retaliate. So that's why I think when you get to the point where cyber can do what kinetic weapons can do, everyone's going to go with kinetic weapons.
We're also dependent now on the internet for everything, for shopping, financially speaking, for you name it. Can the internet be taken down?
Well, never say never, but it's very difficult to do. Remember that the internet was originally proposed in the 1960s as a way of surviving a nuclear exchange. So the idea was that, like, the telephone system had central switching hubs, and if you took those out, then you wouldn't be able to call people. What the internet does is it decentralizes switching all around the world. So even if you take out 1, 2, 3, 4, 100 routers, the traffic will be routed around those dead spots. It's very hard to take down the internet. It has happened in 2016. This is the last story in the book, where these teenage kids make a botnet, which actually ends up taking down the internet. October 21st, 2016, right before the Clinton-Trump election, the at least on the East Coast, all the the internet went down for a good part of the day. So it does happen, but it's very rare, and it just came back up, and that was one of the biggest attacks ever on the internet.
Well, is this the Myra? Is this the Myra bot?
Yeah, this is the Mirai botnet. So the Mirai botnet was built by 3 teenage kids. Originally, it was put together by one of them because he wanted to get out of his calculus exam. He wasn't studying. He was a student at Rutgers, and he didn't want to take this calculus exam, so he decided to DDoS the actual Rutgers University. It cost Rutgers several $1 million to mitigate. And then he wanted to get into a class that was only for upperclassmen. The upperclassmen got the first chance to enroll, so he took down the registration website and then waited for the time that freshmen could enroll, and then he stopped the attack and then enrolled. So, I mean,
and that would lead to the internet being brought down.
Yeah, because what happened was the more and more powerful this botnet became, because what they did was there was something called the Internet of Things, like smart toasters, smart refrigerators. Those were coming online, and they had figured out how to connect them together and use it to extort money from people who ran video game servers, Minecraft servers. So what they would do is like the mafia. They were like, I'm going to make you an offer you can't refuse. If you don't pay us money, we're going to DDoS. We're going to take down your server, and nobody is going to be able to play your games. When the FBI got hot on their tail, they released that code, and every idiot in the world decided to use it. And that's still with us today. The Mirai code is still floating around the internet, being adapted all the time. They released it, and some teenagers, Ireland and Canada, put it together, and they DDoSed a company called Dyn, which handles what's called the domain name translation. Basically, what it does is when you type in www.google.com, it translates that to the numerical IP address. So it's not that the internet went down, is that people had a hard time navigating it. So I would just say that, like, yes, the internet can go down. It's very hard to do. It was designed to be resilient. And, we depend on it. And if it did go down, it would be obviously a very serious thing.
I mean, the Internet of Things is important to think about, because most of these smart devices, they're not really that protected.
Oh, no. In fact, why? So these smart devices exist. A lot of people don't know this. So let me take the opportunity to explain it, right? So there are three kinds of basic operating systems in the world, okay? At least in the Western world, right? There's Microsoft. Those are our PCs, okay? That's Windows. Then we have Apple, and that's the iOS, Mac OS, that's the thing. And then we have this other thing called Linux, okay? And Linux is free, and it was made by hackers in the good sense so that people could have a very secure system that was free. So, of course, all these people who build, who are making these appliances, they want a free operating system. They don't want to have to license the operating system from Apple or from Microsoft, so they just use Linux. The problem is that when they installed Linux, they installed it with default credentials. They put the passwords, they hard-coded the passwords in, and then they put the passwords in their manuals, which were discoverable on Google. So it's like people made these incredibly great locks that nobody can pick, but they left the key on the stoop and had a big sign that said keys for lock. That's what basically happens with the Internet of Things. This was changed in 2018 when California passed their cybersecurity law, which said that Internet of Things devices can't use these default passwords anymore. So this particular problem is not with us so much, although there are really old Internet of Things devices that are still being exploited in this way.
What do you do to exploit a smart device? What does that mean? What would you use it for?
Yeah, so what you do is, just like I reached out to you by clicking on the Zoom link to talk with you, what a computer can do is it can just randomly generate addresses and sites to go visit. And if it finds a site that has a device on it, it checks to see is it running Linux, and if it's running Linux, it then tries to it tries various default credentials that it carries around with it, and it can do it so fast that maybe it finds 1 out of 1,000, but since it can do like 100,000 a minute, it finds a lot of these things just by scanning the internet and then trying things out. It's that simple sometimes.
And what do you do with that smart device as a hacker?
So what you do is you put it together into a botnet. You turn it into a bot. That is, you infect it with malicious hardware, and you connect it up to what's called a C2, a command and control server, which gives instructions to these bots, your toaster, which is infected, to send out illegitimate requests to, let's say, I don't know, Oxfam. Let's say you want to take Oxfam's website down. You hate Oxfam for some reason. So now my smart toaster that's infected has become a cannon in your fight against Oxfam, and I don't even know it because it makes no noise, and I don't care what my smart toaster is doing because I just make toast, a couple times a week. And
but it's a part of, like, what do they call it, like a service denial of service kind of attack?
So this is called a denial of service attack, or a distributed denial of service attack called a DDoS.
It's where you're just overwhelming.
You overwhelm a computer with requests, and you basically tie up its bandwidth so it's busy dealing with illegitimate requests so that the legitimate requests can't come in. It's like if I constantly called your cell phone over and over again, or rang your bell and you kept on coming down to answer the door, and I keep on running away. That's what a DDoS is like. And so now your smart toaster, which is a general computing device running all the metacode that Alan Turing discovered, physicality, duality, can run anything. It runs malicious code and then takes out web services, internet services that the attacker doesn't want to have run.
Scott Shapiro has been our guest. Scott Shapiro is professor of law and philosophy at Yale Law School and director of the Yale Center for Law and Philosophy and its CyberSecurity Lab, and he has joined us for a conversation about his book, Fancy Bear Goes Phishing, The Dark History of the Information Age and 5 Extraordinary Hacks. Scott Shapiro, that was interesting. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. This was really, really fun. I really enjoyed myself.